I'm Jim, and if anything's free in front of me. But Three Musketeers, I'm a Three Musketeers man. So. There you go.
I'm Lorraine. I am picky about my peanut butter chocolate. I only like Justin's dark chocolate. They are addictive, and that's kind of a problem.
First step.
Mine is not my name is Aquetta, and mine is not a bar, but I love peanut M&Ms.
My name is Amaris, and I would say Reese's Cups, but specifically the eggs that come out around Christmas, Easter time, the little trees.
Yeah.
We'll have to do this again.
Where's the chocolate?
I like dark chocolate, but almond joy for candy bar.
Cool. Well, do you want to go?
I don't like chocolate. So like anything that has the least amount of chocolate, so I'll do like a Twix bar or a Mars bar. But I'm also, if I eat a Reese's cup, I poke the inside out and I don't eat the chocolate right now.
I did not know that was possible.
It is totally.
They actually make white chocolate ones. Do you like white chocolate?
Not really.
Never mind.
Was it a childhood trauma?
Personal.
I'm not. I'm not a chocolate person. Like the thought of like people eat Hershey bars grosses me out.
Oh wow.
Just eat it.
I do love chocolate. I particularly love dark chocolate. But I don't eat a lot of candy bars anymore. I used to love the Milky Way, but that feels like I will go to the fair and get a deep fried candy bar once in every 5 years or something. Did everybody go? Well, wow. I love the sounds of the party. So welcome. This is our 4th Go Deep session in this series. We have talked about power. We have talked about abortion and reproductive justice. We've talked about LGBTQ+ pride, and tonight we're talking about colorblind racism. And I'm really hoping this will be a conversation, as all of these have been so far, which is great. But I'm going to start with just sharing a couple of things to get your minds and hearts going around what the Bible and theology have to tell us. I will note that the Bible doesn't actually have to say much about race as we understand it today, because race is a construct and it functions very differently in the ancient world than it does now. But there's still a lot that we can say about it as people. So racism, if you had to define racism, and maybe like folks who are on our AR team don't answer right now, because we'll get to the definition that we use at Green Shoe, but if you were just defining racism, how would you define it? I feel like I'm only going to get good answers from this crowd, so we'll see.
Making judgments about somebody because of their ethnic background.
Okay, making judgments about somebody because of the color of their skin.
More specific, like, you know.
More specifically negative, okay, yeah.
It's the assumption that people as a group have identifiable consistent characteristics based on whatever we call race at any given moment.
Sure. So this question of what even is race in order for us to have racism, yeah. Okay, AR team folks who have been through our training, how would you define racism?
I don't know if anybody has been. Well, you count. I'm on the team.
Well, that's why I meant, yes. Here, I have a slide for it. So, a lot about, so we talk about racism, and this is something that is probably familiar to most of you all, but a lot of times in America, when we talk about racism, people focus mostly on personal attitudes. Do you have biases against a group because of their race or perceived But at Green Street, when we talk about racism, we're trying to think systemically and institutionally and acknowledge that racism is not just prejudice, but prejudice plus power. So there's a reason we started with power in this series, because it shows up in significant ways. So when folks talk about reverse racism or racism against white people, that's something different. So we can think about attitudes and prejudices individually, but if we're talking about racism as a system, power is a really important ingredient to be thinking about. So R equals P plus P, if you want to make it feel like a formula, racism equals prejudice plus power. And people nuance and shift that in a lot of different ways. Any thoughts on this definition or anything you would add or change about it?
I would change the formula just because it bothers me that P and P are the same term, but they
Yes.
represent different things.
That's fair. Maybe P1 and P sub 2.
Yeah.
You probably want it to be P and B for peanut butter.
Oh, yeah. All right. So on Sunday, Courtney gave a wonderful sermon on Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Courtney, do you want to give like a summary of what you talked about, or just salient points?
I was a Black Baptist preacher and gave 3 points. The first being that the text is not meant to ignore the diversity or deny that there's diversity in God's children. It also, secondly, is not meant to minimize or ignore the differences and the struggles that different folks within God's people go through. And thirdly, that it is an inclusive gospel. So these represent kind of 3 constructs that are human oriented, but they were relevant then and we can make them relevant now, which was basically ethnicity, social and economic status, and gender. And so really you can expand that to any type of human categorization, and the gospel is available to everybody. So.
And I thought she captured really well this idea that, yes, we are all equal before God, but that is not a reason to ignore or pretend that inequality in our world does not exist. In fact, it calls us to more seriously examine inequality, injustice, imbalances of power. So this verse has sometimes been used to justify kind of a colorblind approach to race in the church, saying these distinctions don't matter to God, but we matter to God, right? And the way that we experience challenges and opportunities, joy and sorrow in the world matters to God, and so we can't just pretend that these distinctions don't exist. Another quote that often gets used to justify colorblind racism is this from Martin Luther King Jr. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now this is very much the way the world should be, right? But sometimes people act as if MLK was saying this is the way the world is, and therefore we should behave as if we don't see color. This is the phrase that gets used. And if you want to know what one of his 4 little children has to say about that, Bernice King says, being colorblind does not equal justice. So many seem to prefer a claim of not seeing color over the work of eradicating racism and dismantling white supremacy. That is false peace, and that is not the dream or teachings of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Colorblindness does not equal justice. Even if just right now all prejudice and inequality went away, there's still enormous history of trauma that is still happening right now. We can't pretend it's not, even though some folks want to. But we still need to recognize that. Even if everything were perfect right at this moment, which of course it is not. Any thoughts or comments on that?
That's 2 months ago. I'm just surprised at how recent it is.
I noticed that too. I read another one from her from a little over a year ago. Being colorblind is not the solution to racism. See people fully, love people deeply. And I thought of this poem by Nayyirah Waheed. She says, never trust anyone who says they do not see color. This means to them you are invisible. And I'm reminded of, I had a friend who's African American who talked about this very thing, that her dad was appointed to a lot of cross-racial appointments in churches, so a Black pastor in white churches. And so she grew up around a lot of white peers, and so many people, she said, would say, well, I just don't think of you as black. I don't see you as black. And she said, they mean that well, but to me it means they don't see me at all. So this is something that I've always carried with me. You want to talk about that a little bit?
I think like what you were just saying, like when people say I don't see you as black, it just makes me think like there's this inherent assumption that that's like it's a bad thing that you'd be ashamed of, like what's wrong with being seen as black if you're black?
Exactly. We only do that kind of thing with things that we have a negative association with. Like, people with disabilities, we'll talk about that too sometimes, but yeah, I was struck by that. I went down a rabbit hole of contemporary Christian music from the 90s. Pray for my brain in the next few days with those unfortunate earworms. But there's a Michael W. Smith song called Colorblind, and it's basically him saying, like, can't we all just be colorblind? But if you listen to the lyrics, and even if you want to see a really fun video, there's a live video of him performing it, and it's all white performers and an all white audience. The song's really addressed to white people, and there's a line in it where he's talking about, because someone's different, they assume they're up to something. And this is using whiteness as normal and talking about people of color as a deviation and saying, well, we should accept them anyway. There's this ongoing centering of whiteness that happens a lot in the church. Again, assuming negativity.
And to me, even though people say this, but then people will say things like, you speak well, or being a well person, or they'll be like, you're not like the rest, or sort of like distinguishing you from perceptions of who Black people are. So it's sort of like that color blindness kind of thing. Like you're a part of us. With us.
Yeah.
I had a coworker when I was probably 20, I don't know, I was in my 20s, and she told me I was the whitest Black girl she had ever met. And she really meant that, like, in a very nice way. I knew her. I knew that she did not mean it to be harmful. And I kind of, at that time, I kind of just like chuckled it off because what else do you do, right? One of the things that Sarah and I talked about that I think sometimes is not assumed by folks who are not white is that Black people have a hard enough time seeing themselves. And and I don't say that to be, we are not a monolith, but we tend to, because of not wanting to be, seen in my color or those types of things, often you find Black people who are struggling, as I said Sunday, with being, it's a good thing that I'm Black, and because we have if you look at the Black people in this room, none of us have the same tone. And so, if you look at the kind of the range of color that exists within the Black community, that creates colorism and racism within our own race, right? And sometimes we have joked about it to lighten the mood. I have a sister who is very close to Sarah's complexion, and I have a sister who's darker. And, so we kind of had the joke of yeah, you would have been in the house, because but it's these things that we've said over time to kind of lighten our own discomfort, if you will, with embracing us. And historically, if you go back to the beginning of kind of all of the movements, within the Black race, there was a struggle to move from being called Negro to it was when James Brown said, I'm Black and I'm proud, those who were big on being called Negroes were no, I'm not associating with you if you're gonna talk about being Black. Because being Black was such a harmful thing. So there's so many things that the Black community within itself have to overcome to see our own color, much less to have to kind of face the world and say, see me and celebrate me. We're still needing to say internally, see me, see us, and celebrate us. And so, you know, when you were met with comments like, in corporate America, I would get, you're very articulate, that was the word. Right, and that was like, among Black people, we kind of knew, like, that was code for, you sure didn't show up like they thought we were gonna show up kind of thing. So it's a, that whole notion of not seeing or seeing color, it's still a struggle within our own race, much less to bring it kind of out to everybody else and overcome the stigmas and all of those things.
Yeah, and another way that I feel like that kind of shows up is with, some Black folks who may feel like, that may feel uncomfortable with ways that other Black people show up because you're looking too Black around these white folks, right? And that's gonna bring that attention to us, you know, why are you speaking like that? Why are you dressing like that? Why are you dancing like that? Why are you doing these things? You know, all that kind of respectability stuff is like, you know, thinking that perhaps if you behave or look in certain ways, it'll bring you a little closer to whiteness, and maybe that'll make it a little better when it really won't. And so, I think that gets tied up into that
If
too.
you're not Black enough, you know, try to meet all of these internal things that we have going on. And I think it's been part of the reason why that quote is recent is because it really has been in the last few years that the movement has gone, no, see color, like, you know, because it was such a big thing that we didn't want color to prevent us from being in spaces. But now we're like, no, we want you to see us and we want to be in spaces. And so when I came here, my child said to me, well, you know they're hiring you to be yourself, right? Like, because they didn't know where they expected me to show up and preach like Sarah, you know, and be quiet or be loud like I normally am, you know, and so there are all of these things that show up and we're contending internally all the time, so.
The other thing I thought about with the whole colorblind stuff is just like sometimes I've been in conversation with some white people and they're like, oh, you know, the guy who's really tall, he had on a red shirt. You know, the guy, the Black guy, like you're just thinking because it's just that uncertainty about when can I say Black? When can I acknowledge that I saw that he was Black? I saw that he was Black, but can I say that?
Well, on the flip side, often, you know, I've had peers where white folks will comment on someone's Blackness when it's not relevant or helpful to the conversation, right? So it's just
Right,
on both
right,
sides
right.
of that.
Yeah.
We can't pretend that we don't notice people's skin tone or anything like that.
I was gonna say something that's this is really interesting for me, and thinking through my work experience in life. And, you know, so working for 40 years in public education and stuff. And I would say 40 years ago, the coworkers I had that were Black, African American, the different terminologies at the different times, were not as empowered. And they didn't threaten me at all. You know, and there was a sense of I was the powerful one, I had all the power, they really were shy about, you know, and kind of they were quiet, as long as they didn't want to be heard, you know, they almost wanted to be invisible. And then as these years have gone on, and I was just trying to think about I'm a school teacher, and my Black coworkers now that I work with, in many ways, I'm very uncomfortable now because they are so empowered and so strong, and with the whole white supremacy knowledge and critical race theory, thinking through it, you know, when you look at me, you know, yuck, you know, big white boy, you know, and that's almost uncomfortable to think about, you know, that's who I am now instead of the power guy 40 years ago and having all the advantages. Now I'm this, you know, guy that everybody knows got here because of all his privilege. And so it's a weird thing to think through on Anyway, it's something we thought about.
Well,
It's
and
changed.
to the point that was made earlier, part of it is they now need to show up black and strong.
Mhm.
Otherwise, there is,
Absolutely.
they're gonna look like they're not black enough, or they're not down enough, you know, like we are in this like place now where, if you don't show up that way, you look like you're not down for your people. And, you know, kind of getting to that point where you can unapologetically be black and unapologetically love your fellow person who is not black. There's some people who are still not there and quite honestly don't know how to get there.
And it's like even these conflicts around, you know, are you black enough? Like that construct is created by white supremacy as a way of creating a monolith out of the black experience. This like flattening of difference within races and ethnicities and experience is a function of white supremacy. And white people are affected by it too in a different way. But that creating a monolith, flattening a difference is a function of that.
I don't want to turn the conversation towards gender, but it struck me the similarities between the experience of people who don't have power, people who have power with men and women. I've been told, oh, you're a really whatever for a female, you know, and that kind of, it's like this, I hear that echoes of that, you know, that sort of prejudice or sexism. And then also even amongst women, like who was sharing 40 years ago, like think about all the different, are we feminine enough? You know, is your shaved head feminine, you know, enough? Is my long hair more feminine? Like you have to think about all these things, and you know that to me, I just wanted to, you know, point out that there's that through line of human experience.
Yeah. I mean, you know, we could say white supremacy. We could say the white supremacist hetero patriarch. Right? All of, you know, like all of these things are but really, these things are all sort of about us. You're fine. We love you.
Even though.
No, it's fine. But again, we're talking about systemic stuff, but it does you know, we think about like misogynoir against black women as being distinct from how racism broadly functions, like intersectionality is real. Yes, Laura.
I have a friend who's a retired teacher, white, and she has a little sister who's black. And at one point, her little sister, when she was about 10 years old, referred to my friend as an old white lady. And my friend was really wounded, hurt. And I couldn't help laughing because I said, you know, we are old white ladies. You know, that's what we are. And so, you know, you should just accept that. But I think what was going on is a lot of people, and I think that she would like to be colorblind. I think that's her kind of ethos. They want to think that we're all recognized as individuals. But the reality is that all kinds of things matter. Age, gender, physical strength, tallness, shortness, you know, all these things, people are taking that in, and especially if they don't know you very well, that's what they see and that's what they think. And it's important to be realistic about that, because we can't really, I mean, I guess that's where you get back to the quote that we started with, where God can know us all, but we don't know each other in the same way. We see these social constructs. Tall guys are powerful. They're the winners, right? They're the ones who get high incomes. You know, so you see a tall guy come in, tall white guy come in, and you know, immediately you make all these assumptions. And that's where we live in. So we see through a glass darkly, right?
I also think, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Just that part of it's a recentering. Like when I was in college 25 years ago, it's like this paradigm shift of what is the norm group. And everything, even for me to this day, is everything is often centered around whiteness and white maleness. And so I think it feels uncomfortable for everybody, for me, for you, when Black people or when people who have not been the mainstream norm get recentered, even if they're just slightly, like become a part of the conversation, it becomes uncomfortable for people to sort of say, well, I never considered that, or I never considered to think of it through this particular lens or through this particular experience. So I just think it's a shift. I don't think the shift has happened, but it's a shift that as it begins to happen, like even slightly, it creates a discomfort for people. So.
Yeah. I think it's just worth mentioning what a struggle this is for parents, trying to understand and think about how to raise their children, and a generation that probably has tried the colorblind theory, thinking that was the best thing to do, teach your child not to see it, and then the world will be better. And so now we've got, people who were raised that way, but that's, that's not where we are right now. And why it's so important that Ibram X. Kendi wrote his anti-racist baby book.
Yes.
That even our littlest ones are taught to see and celebrate.
So I have two children that are adopted from China, and one was born without her right forearm. And I learned from the time she was teeny-tiny, if you teach people to ignore the difference, it's not the difference that gets ignored, it's the whole child. Mm-hmm. So I just think that's a lesson that goes far and wide.
Yeah.
You mentioned articulate, right? Our daughter is biracial, and she went to work for Liberty Tax Service. And the gentleman who had the franchise, white, looked at her and said, "You belong in our North Forest store." That is 52, right? So she went and worked there, and she did really well. And they promoted her to manager of that office, and she was the manager. And she came home one day and she said, "Dad, I don't understand. They tell me they don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not talking the language of the people that come in." And I'm thinking to myself, is that because you were raised in a white family and heard all of our dialogue and then became part of yours? She said, well, she was going to have to figure out how she could talk I don't want to say talk down to the folks, but change her way. And she did very well, so she was able to change her position, but it was an interesting thought.
Well, I've got a video to share, and Courtney had one to share too. So I'm going to share the spoken word piece by Guante is the name of the poet, and it's white supremacy is not the shark, it's the water. And just because it's such an important concept. So online folks, I'm going to drop a link because I don't think the internet will let me share that without cutting me off. So see how this goes. There's an arrow.
You're lucky it's not for patriots.
How to explain white supremacy to a white supremacist. Sometimes you are lit match stocks.
that paradigm shift, I think, really started, it was public, right? Because you had social media making it public. And so, like, one of the big pushes that I was seeing from the Black community to our non-Black friends was, you should be striking this conversation at home. You know, like, it's not enough to just say, well, I support you, but like, what are you saying? And so, like, having that trigger, you know, at the family dinner table, in the places, because those are those small movements and changes that begin to like have conversations happen in other spaces. And so from my perspective, it's like taking that opportunity to encourage the conversation, and then just say, like, you know, wherever it goes based on kind of those responses, it's for me a big piece of it is just getting people, getting your mom, getting folks to have the conversation, because too many times, and the beautiful thing is you don't have to be afraid in your family at the dinner table that somebody Black is gonna go, I can't believe you just said that, because you're sitting at your own table, right? And so some of those fears that I think of, somebody's gonna think I'm prejudiced or racist if I say X, that should be a safe space to have those conversations, and those who are supportive need to be helping to bring people along. At a small, like, I have a girlfriend, we are 3 days apart, she's white. She was raised in the sticks. She came to college at Salem College, we're the same age. And she called the first Black person she met colored. And we are the same age, but that's all she knew. So it took a Black person to go, don't say that no more. And, you know, but she really, like, that's all. So it's like having that space to have those conversations to get them going.
Yeah, it's not a conversation people like to bring up necessarily, but I think, yeah, you know, I relish doing that kind of thing though, and you know, I'm in the perspective of a family that is, we're good white liberals. Like, I was raised to think that my job was to be a good white person and to not be racist. I no longer think that is helpful to anybody, but so that, at least in my context, the topic is not forbidden, but I have other family where it is really touchy. And sometimes even just modeling and sharing, this is something that's important to me that I've been reading or listening to or engaging with, taking that sort of personal ownership and saying, this is a part of my life, inviting that conversation, you know, I think that can be a good step. But if other people have ideas or have done this in their own families, Jesse.
I think sometimes whether or not somebody cares is whether or not they can live a moment in this other person's shoes and see how unnecessarily hard their lives are. Mm-hmm. And then the second part is, do they care enough to do something about it?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, on piggybacking on that, you know, I've sat through, I've gotten to go to some of those sessions where they do a poverty simulation, and you see what it's like to, you know, have to go on the bus to get this and to do that, and you just keep getting farther and farther behind. And it's always about poverty. It's not about race. It's just about poverty. And I'd almost like to see one of those done for white supremacists like me, that good white liberals like me, or whatever, that puts you in the seat of a Black person from 1950s, and then that's your parent, you know, or something like that, and understanding how they couldn't get a house loan, how they did not have the same options for education, for jobs, how so-and-so got them in jail, how they had to put up, you know, just different things that would also give you that same maybe empathy that we try to do for poor people, but to do it on a race basis would be good for me. Now, it's good for anybody else. You know.
Yeah, and it is hard because I think that can certainly be helpful to some people, but you know, I think we need a paradigm shift in a lot of ways, of not just from the vantage point of this unjust system, oh, okay, I see the injustice, because I think then the question is, then what next? And as you know, I agree that things haven't really shifted, but at least the conversation has shifted, and that discomfort that comes up is evidence of our scarcity-based,
dominating power system that is centered on whiteness in this country. And so we both, I think sometimes it's, the evidence is abundant. The evidence of the inequity is abundant and clear and there. And so,
I don't agree with you as a white person growing up in a white world. I do not agree that it is obvious to anybody in my
I think if you look,
world.
I should have said if you look,
Yeah.
right? Yes,
But it has
totally
to be-
get,
It has to be taught. We don't,
Yeah,
we're
absolutely.
blind to it in general as a group of lovely white people.
And
Sure.
unfortunately, diversity training has been a joke for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So the work of, we have diversity and equity training at our place, and then it's about like different religions, which is valid, but also not like dealing with the race issue, or we like different music, fine, but also not dealing with, and so doing real justice and equity and diversity and inclusion work is still like a really tough and in a lot of ways ineffective.
Our IDE is doing introverts, extroverts. Like, okay.
Right.
Cool.
I was teaching.
That's what the diversity.
Yeah. Well, no, one of the modules.
Oh.
Yeah. I was like,
You're supposed to understand it as a metaphor.
there was a university at some point that was talking about diversity in their student body, and they were talking about shoe size and whether you're a dog or cat person, and I was like, ooh, it's not quite. Anyway, yeah.
I teach science and the middle schoolers that I was teaching last week, and I just said, I know it's so frustrating. I have to tell you about all these scientists, and they're all these white male guys. Do you know why they're all white male? Because we didn't allow anybody else to have those positions. And I know this is critical race theory, and if you go home and tell your parents, I'm gonna get in trouble. But this is the reality. That's why we don't have any women and people of color that we're studying from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and up till 1990. So, but that's you don't hear anybody in general say that kind of thing to these poor kids. They need to hear it.
subject of color. Being okay, as I said Sunday, growing up, I was taught not to see color, because we're all God's children. And so in fact, my dad told me that he named me Courtney so that when I became an adult and went into the workforce, no one would be able to decide whether I was black or white based on my name. So, that idea of like, why must we always go to color? Black people struggle with being okay with but there is a color thing, And so that, a lot of Baldwin's work, he came back from Paris, if you know anything about him, came back feeling like he had to come and say something. And one of the things that he distinguishes is that there's a difference between being a spokesperson and a witness. And he says the spokesperson feels like they have the authority to speak on behalf of somebody. But the witness, he felt like he was called to be a witness to speak truth of what he had seen. And sometimes that is the hardest thing to get comfortable with, is to just because let me talk about me. I really don't want to see anybody be prejudiced. I want to be able to look and say, no, it was anything but that. And I'm black, and I want to believe the best for people, and sometimes it's not easily recognized. And so that was why I really wanted to drive that home, because that is a perspective that was in the 60s, and this is still true today. Everything he said is still very much true for black men, black women today.
And I love that. I don't know if these people hate me, and it doesn't matter.
Right.
The outcome is still inequality, injustice.
And he said, he's quoted for saying, I don't think all white people are bad. And he was met with some criticism for that. Well, you can't, where are you really at on the, and he was equally friends with Martin Luther King as he was with Malcolm X. And so he was in a really weird position, but what he talks about is still very much relevant today. Thoughts? He's very articulate, right? It's kind of hard to, wow, he said a lot.
The thing that strikes me this way is he doesn't say, he's like, how do you protect? He doesn't say his woman. But also, to me, I think about intersectionality, because we also know James Baldwin was gay, right? But from that particular clip, it may not have been evident. How not only is this a black man in America, this is a gay black man who goes to Paris and writes Giovanni's room and talks about it's just, I think that I'm a lover of James Baldwin, but I just think that his perspective, his ability to see and witness is very, and his articulation of that is very beautiful.
Because it's not, he wasn't accusatory, to Pastor Sarah's point. He was just saying, this is what I have witnessed to. If you haven't seen I Am Not Your Negro, it's a very good documentary. Very good. It's hard, it's sobering, but very good.
So in the -1 minutes we have left, what do we do with this as a church? Because I will, I've kind of found for myself as I talk with white Christians, there tends to be a lot of emphasis on kind of getting our own hearts right and working on our biases and our education, our attitude, and that is very important. And if whatever I'm doing to improve myself is not materially reducing danger for Black people in America, there needs to be more. So we obviously don't have time to solve, we're not going to solve racism tonight. But what can the church do? What should the church be doing around this in this day and age?
One thing I just offer to consider is, as you're thinking about not being colorblind, when you recognize color, you are also acknowledging identity. Identity. part of my identity is that I'm a Black woman. And so being able to name that and give folks, and being comfortable with yourself and really having conversations to the point of where, you know, sometimes it's just, I have one white friend who, anything she doesn't understand, she just asks. Because she really wants to know, like, she's like, is it okay if I touch this hair? You know, like, just, that seemed trivial, but are like legitimate questions. And asking, you can talk to an older Black person and they may say, I don't want to be called African American. I want to be called Negro. Just have that conversation. You know, you come talk to a younger person. So I think part of what we can do in our own work, but that starts to spread across, is just having those conversations, because I can't speak for all Black people, but I appreciate someone who genuinely wants to understand, like, how do Black people really feel about X? What would you really like me to say? How would you like me to address? I want to really know how you feel, because that starts saying, I want to be seen. And in turn, giving that same, extending that same grace back, right? What would you like to know from me as a white person about it? Because I think Black people some Black people may be as uncomfortable asking white people questions about, like, how do you really feel? And having this, like, safe space that both parties can be transparent about what it is they want to understand from each other.
I think you make a really great point about identity and, you know, and I know this is not directly related, but having children who were adopted, I had some adoptive parents who would say, well, I don't want my children to feel different, but the fact of the matter is they are different. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's that assumption that, like somebody else back here pointed out, that there's a negative connotation to being a different race, being a different color, having a limb difference, or being adopted. It's who you are, and it's beautiful and wonderful and unique. And it's just like, even though it may kind of feel awkward to say, hey, what happened to your leg? What happened to your arm? You know, just, don't shame your children for asking those questions, but what you can help them learn to do is be polite and be respectful when you do ask. Hey, help me understand what happened or what's different,
Genuine. And one thing I just want to say, because it's going to bug me that I didn't say it, it is okay to not find some others. Well, I understand how you feel, because you don't.
Because you don't.
And so sometimes, like, and this is not calling you out, choosing your example, like, sometimes I can go, well, I get it, because I'm a woman and women have been discriminated. No, you don't. What women's experience is different than what Black people experience. And so one of the things that I think we just got to, all people have to be, it's kind of like when somebody has a death in the family and people feel like they just gotta say something to, like, say that you have empathy. You can have empathy without having your story too. And so I think when we have these conversations, we've got to be okay with just letting that Black person have their moment.
And listen.
And listen.
Listening is so important.
Yeah, listening to understand.
Yes.
I think exactly what this video is showing about the evidence, like, we as a church have power, and, like, how can we not hoard that power? How can we give it away? What is the evidence of what we actually know to be true? If you're asking for what steps can we take, if we believe this, and we also have a power structure within the church. There's a hierarchy, so to speak, of people within the church, and so how do we, make sure everybody feels like, because honestly, like, at the church level, if someone is spiritually inclined, the church, for me anyways, is like, that's my access to the spiritual truth. That's beyond the material. That's actually the fabric of, like, who I am. And so if you have authority over me in that, you have more authority than the government, because I would do something for God that I would not do for the government. And so I think that's a really precious power that we do have. And so what's our evidence of, that we don't hate anybody, or that, like, do we take the things that we have and infuse them back into, instead of hoarding? Question.
I think that it's probably important to acknowledge that there are good liberal churches that think this is an issue that we should be concerned about. And that's not what this is. Christianity is always contextual. And Christianity in Hong Kong, Christianity in France, Christianity in Peru is a different thing. And Christianity in this country, this question is the central issue for the church in America. If we don't speak to this, there is nothing we can claim about the gospel. Nothing at all. And so it is the heart of everything that church is supposed to mean here, to me.
And something that I've had family members who are threatened by conversations of race. And my mom has been doing a lot of research in our family history. We have slave racism. And I've got cousins that don't want to talk about that or want to make that, part of ancient history and not something we grapple with as a family here and now. And I find that in that is this fear of losing, whether it's comfort or power or resources, of losing something, and trying to say, this is about liberation for all of us. This is, the call of the church is to be liberated from these oppressive structures. Any final thoughts? Oh yeah, we don't have time to look at this really, but this is a continuum of we never have time to. Our interest in students look at this a lot, but continuing on the front, I'm going to share it to you. Okay, but basically, I can send this if you're interested to look at it, but it's kind of saying there's distinctions between, you can be an exclusionary institution, you can try to welcome people but not actually be anti-racist, and then when are you actually transforming and being a fully inclusive, multiracial organization, that there is this continuum of what that looks like. And I think we often, where does Green Street's usually somewhere around here, I think we keep landing, but anyway, it's a useful tool for organizations thinking about how they're approaching this in a realistic way and not just doing it.
Yeah, would you send that out?
Sure. Yeah, that would like to. Yeah, if y'all don't hear from me, email me.
I would say that go ahead.
Do you have a quick answer as to why we're in the center and we're not at the far end?
I don't know that I'm the one to answer that. I mean, I could, but.
Well, yeah, you are. You're the boss.
I don't know that I have a quick answer.
Okay.
I don't think I would do it justice to, so maybe we can have a separate discussion about that. I don't mean to not answer. Yeah.
I would say, if nothing else, the fact that when we lay this continuum out, the times that we have had a chance to kind of go through with groups, not everyone is taking us all the way over to 5. Some people might feel like, oh, we're 4 or 5, we're good. But there are differences that remain in the experience in what is perceived. And so, I think we can't claim to be there if we all
Is there also a danger if you say you're there, that you feel like the work is all done?
Yes.
And so you can go,
Yeah, and I think that is something that we do wrestle with here at this church. I think some people, in terms of continuing the conversation, there's some folks who are like, oh, I've had that conversation, I'm good, right? And no, not when the evidence is what the evidence is, like James Baldwin said. So, if nothing else, the commitment to keep the conversation going is how we move forward.
I was gonna say, I think that conversations around race are very difficult to have in multiracial spaces, right? I'll just be going on and on with my mother on the phone about how I felt like it was a microaggression that all of my colleagues were saying gang, gang, gang. And for me, when I hear gang, it's a euphemism for something else, right? It's not gang. It's not like a group of people who come together. It is gang looks a particular way. East Winston looks a particular way. Bus riders look a particular way at my school. And so people don't want to really discuss race. I feel like they shut down, and then when you call it out or when you try to have the conversation, in my experience, I just go silent because I just don't have the energy for it a lot of times. So I just think figuring out how to have safe spaces for people to feel comfortable, not guilty, not like somebody is going after them, that they're the big bad wolf, or that it sucks all of your energy out to be in conversations with people who don't see the race stuff that they're saying without saying it. So I just don't know how to, I'm not saying that. I think our church does a very good job of being able to have multi-racial conversations. I don't know that other institutions do it that we are.
I think we do a better job.
Yeah.
But I think it's still a struggle sometimes. Even I think there's that kind of internalized thing that some Black folks may feel like, oh, let me make sure. Okay, I'm gonna speak my truth, but I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. And it's like this kind of
Like code switching.
Yeah.
Code switching.
Yeah, code switching, or even making people feel comfortable, but putting that above the importance of you telling the truth.
Right.
Like, I need to keep you comfortable more so than I need to tell the truth. And maybe that's about a learned survival tactic, like this is how I gotta make it in the world, and so I don't think that stops when we come to church, you know what I mean? But I do think that it is easier here, definitely, to have conversations than it is at any other institution.
One thing I'll name just in full transparency is the Black church experience is very different than the white church experience. And so you kind of figure out how you show up as a Black person in coming from a context that is very different, very charismatic, those kind of things, and how you show up as a Black person in a white church experience it's a thing. So that I think that's part of what feeds into where we fit in the continuum is just the experience of church itself.
If we think about power and culture, Green Street, 120 years ago was founded by a bunch of white people. The first Black member joined in the 90s. This church is culturally in a lot of ways white, and I as a pastor struggle sometimes to balance acknowledging that reality without erasing the presence of our POC members. And we've had lots of great conversations about how to incorporate elements of Black church tradition into worship in a way that feels authentic to the folks that are here without our white musicians appropriating in particular. It's tricky, and I think some of it too is the conversation has changed so much over the years where diversity was an inherent good for so long in how we talked, or it was thought to be an inherent good. And diversity meaning just who was in the room, was there a mix of how people looked, and we're realizing that it was not that simple as churches, and so figuring out how to have those harder conversations and what does it actually look like to shift power is just a really vital question for the church that I don't have good answers to as I stand here, the white woman lead pastor of this congregation. So there's a lot more there, but so good. Well, I think we can wrap up, but thank y'all so much for being here, for being part of this conversation. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, and everybody.